Imagine a small town, lost in time, where residents avoid talking about a past stained by something terrible. In the 1990s, a group of children disappeared without traces. But what makes this story different from the others is what came later. They were never found. Its bodies have never been buried, but somehow they never departed. Each year, the same night they disappeared, the home's flashes, whispers go through the deserted streets, and some people claim to have seen children's silhouettes, standing on the corners, empty eyes and moving mouths, without emitting any sound. The only living witness to this tragedy is a woman who at the time was just a girl. She survived, but it was never the same. And this is your story. In the 1990s, the small town of Hollow Creek was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other, and the children played freely through the dirt streets. But one night changed everything. It was autumn, and the reddish leaves covered the floor like a dry blood carpet. A group of 6 children used to play in the woods near the old abandoned church. Residents always warned, don't stay there after sunset. They said that the land in that area was cursed, that anyone who dared challenge the darkness would never return the same. But children are curious, and the promise of adventure has always been stronger than fear. On the night of the disappearance, witnesses reported hearing laughter and murmurs from the woods, followed by a deep and disturbing silence. When parents realized that their children had not returned home, the searches started immediately. Lanterns cut the darkness, calling the names of the children who never responded. No trace of them was found that night, but the city was not long to realize that something was terribly wrong. In the following days, residents began to hear light knots in the windows at dawn. They were soft, rhythmic, as if small hands insisted on being noticed. Dogs barked at nothing, and the air seemed to get cold at dusk. Then came the whispers, children's fosters calling by the names of those who dare to pass near the woods. Finally, the most disturbing evidence arose. A lady, as she went out to get wood behind her house, found something that made her scream in panic. Small children's shoes, perfectly aligned at the entrance of the forest. They were clean, as if the children were still around. But where were their owners? The city mourned, but without bodies, there were no funerals. Without answers, there was no peace, and Hollow Creek was never the same. The years passed, but Hollow Creek never forgot. The woods became a place avoided even by the most skeptical, a space where darkness seemed to have a life of its own. No tree was cut, no way has been traced again. But for Emily, the only survivor of that night, the terror had never been behind us. Emily was only 7 years old when she disappeared with others, but somehow it was found the next morning, alone, sitting on the old church's staircase, with an empty look and a strange mark on the arm, like an ancient symbol burned on his skin. She didn't speak for months, did not answer the questions. Her parents said she awakened in the middle of the night, sweating cold, muttering names they didn't recognize. When he turned 15, Emily began to remember, but what returned to your mind was not something that could be easily explained. She remembered the woods that night, of shadows that emerged between the trees, from the laughing of the other children turning into suffocated screams. She remembered cold hands holding her wrist and pulling her into the middle of the forest, where the soil was damp and pulsating as she breathed. There was a clearing. In the center of it, a well of old and moss stones. It was not an ordinary well. Something inside moved. Something called. The children, one by one, approached, as if they were hypnotized. When the first one looked inside, a scream cut the silence of the night. But it was not just a scream of dread. It was an impossible sound, as if your voice had been torn from reality. Emily tried to escape, tried to hold her best friend's hand, but he didn't react. His eyes were white, empty, lifeless. She didn't know how she escaped. All he remembered was from a tall, twisted figure emerging from the wells of the well, long hands dragging on the floor. The smell of rotten meat and damp earth invaded its lungs. Something whispered in her ear, something that to this day she can't repeat without feeling a sharp chill in her spine. Then suddenly she was on the church staircase, as if she had never left there. But I knew this was not true. Something brought her back, and something was left behind. Or worse, something came out with her. Since then, the curse has strengthened itself. Every year, in the same night, residents of the city feel their presence. They see the silhouettes of the children standing on the fog, their faces disfigured by time, the empty eyes, like the night of the disappearance. And Emily knows that one day she will have to go back, because deep in your mind, a voice whispers without stopping, "You should never have left." The years passed, and Emily tried to get away from Hollow Creek in every way. He moved to a large city where he could get lost between the crowds, where the past looked like a distant nightmare. But fate never forgets. On the eve of his 30th birthday, Emily began to listen again. First, they were just subtle noises, like the wind of the wind passing through the dried leaves. But as night was advanced, the noise became whispers, whispers of children's voices, murmuring his name. Then the phone rang. It was an unknown number. When attending, he only heard silence for a few seconds, and then a low and irregular breathing. Emily's heart shot. A child voice, distorted as if it came from an old radio, broke the silence. "Do you remember the woods?" She hung up the phone at the same time. The sweat dripped by his neck. He tried to convince himself that it was a prank, that his mind was preaching pieces on her. But when she turned to the mirror of the room, she saw something that froze her blood. There, in the reflection, were the 6 children, pale with dirt, dirty clothes, empty eyes like dark craters. But the worst was not to see them. The worst was to realize that her lips moved in perfect sync, forming words she couldn't hear. The nightmare had returned. That night Emily dreamed of the woods. In the dream, she was again in the clearing before the well. Something inside him still called, and this time, there was no running away. The children were around, pointing to her. The air was dense, heavy, impregnated with a decomposition smell. And then, she remembered. He remembered what really happened that night. Emily didn't escape by chance. She was left behind. Being inside the well allowed her to be, but not without a price. An agreement was sealed. The 6 children not only disappeared, they were delivered. Emily should have been the 7th, but something made her escape, something that now required debt payment. The dream turned into a suffocating nightmare. The voices echoed in his stronger, more demanding head. "Come back, come back." When Emily woke up, her body was covered with dark marks, like small hands printed on her skin. His nose was bleeding. She tried to scream, but her voice didn't come out. The city called her back. Without choice, she took the car and drove for hours, crossing empty roads until she reached the Hollow Creek. Time seemed to have stopped there. The houses, the streets, everything was the same as it had left years ago. But something was wrong. No sound, no movement. The city looked dead. The woods awaited her. Emily felt her body guided, as if something pulled her over her chest. The trees were higher than remembered, and the fog seemed to dance around their steps. When he arrived at the clearing, he was the old well, untouched by time, and around him, the children. But this time, they were not just stopped. They were whispering softly in a macabre melody, while something began to emerge from the shadows of the well. Fine and grey hands, long and rotten nails dragging on the edge. A horny face, without eyes, without defined strokes, just a twisted mouth, smiling. Emily tried to run, but her legs failed. The floor under his feet seemed to hold his ankles. And then the final truth was told. You should have stayed. The thing in the well lifted completely. It was not human, never out. It was something old, something hungry, and I wanted your offering. The children, still whispering, began to approach, their faces distorted as they came closer, the flesh peeling, the eyes turning into black holes. Emily tried to scream, but her lips didn't move. She felt her hands cold, climbing around her skin, a terrible weight pulling her down. Her feet began to slide toward the well, as if an invisible force dragged her inside. The last thing he saw before being swallowed by darkness was the night sky erasing, the stars disappearing, and for a moment she heard laughs, children's laughs. The cycle had completed. Emily finally returned home, and Hollow Creek would keep waiting for the next lost soul. And so, the city of Hollow Creek is still haunted by a secret that no one dared to mention aloud. Emily was just another piece of a much larger game, a game that repeats generation after generation. Perhaps, somewhere other children have heard the call. Maybe the well is waiting for your next offering. And you, have you ever felt that something watches you in the darkness? Have you heard whispers when you were completely alone? If one day you come across a forgotten place for time, think well before entering. Some mysteries do not want to be discovered. If this story shivered you, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more dark reports like this. Do you know any sinister urban legend, or have you lived something inexplicable? Tell your experience in the comments. And if you want to keep diving into the terror, click on the suggested video on the screen. But beware, some stories may be more than just stories. Good night, and sleep well if you get it.